Mafia boss entered the room furious, until he saw his ex asleep. With their twins in his bed, rain slashed against the marble columns of the Russo estate as night wrapped itself around the building like a dark velvet cloak. The kind that carried secrets and ghosts of the men who had walked its halls before him. Dominic Russo stepped out of the black Maserati, his tailored coat soaked within seconds, his boots echoing through the courtyard where fountains no longer sang but hissed with the rage of the storm. The air smelled of gunpowder and sea salt, remnants of the port where he had settled another score only hours ago. And his mind still pulsed with the rhythm of violence, the weight of command pressing against his spine like an invisible crown made of thorns. Every flicker of lightning revealed the silent sculptures of angels and demons carved into the mansion's facade, stone witnesses to a man who had spent half his life balancing between salvation and damnation. Inside, the corridors were dim, the chandeliers swaying from the tremor of thunder, their crystals scattering ghostly light along the golden frames of family portraits that time had not dared to fade. Dominic's shadow moved across the walls like a memory he couldn't escape, the reflection of a man forged in fire, bound by loyalty, and haunted by betrayal. His fists tightened as he approached the staircase leading to his private wing, that sacred space no one dared to enter without permission. Yet his security cameras had gone dark, and that silence screamed louder than bullets ever could. Each step he took left a trail of water on the polished marble, his breath steady but cold, the pulse of anger burning quietly beneath the surface of his control. Somewhere in the distance, the wind moaned through cracked windows, carrying whispers of the sea, whispers that seemed to know his name, to mock his power. He passed the grand piano that once filled the house with music when life had meant more than blood and revenge. Now its keys were silent, covered in dust, like the dreams he had buried under the weight of his empire. The smell of rain mixed with the faint trace of jasmine, a scent he had not felt in years, one that should not have been there, one that twisted the edge of his composure. His heartbeat changed rhythm, from fury to confusion, as memories of a softer time flashed through his mind, hands that once touched him not for fear, but for love. Laughter that echoed through this same hall when it still belonged to a man, not a monster. He reached the top of the stairs, paused before the heavy wooden door carved with the Russo crest, and in that stillness before entry, the house seemed to hold its breath with him. The storm outside cracked open the night, lightning pouring through the stained glass window, painting his face in shards of silver and blue, and for a moment, he saw himself reflected in the glass, eyes hollow, jaw clenched, a ruler of ruins. The handle was cold beneath his gloved hand as he turned it slowly, the metal grinding against years of secrets, and the door opened to a rush of air that smelled like warmth, like life, like something that should not exist in a world so consumed by violence. His boots sank slightly into the carpet as he stepped inside, expecting the chaos of intrusion, papers scattered, safe broken, the scent of fear, but instead the room was dim, calm, impossibly calm. The curtains swayed gently, carrying the rhythm of rain, and the fire in the marble hearth had burned low, glowing like the dying heart of a forgotten god. His eyes scanned every corner with the precision of a predator, searching for the source of trespass, until they stopped, frozen upon the bed where his control shattered. There, beneath the faint golden light, lay Serena Vale, her body curled protectively around two small shapes, her breathing soft and even, her hair spilling across his silk sheets like ink over parchment. Dominic's mind stilled completely, every instinct, every scar, every battle-hardened thought dissolving into silence. The gun in his hand trembled, its weight meaningless now, his heart locked between disbelief and something far deeper, something that clawed its way out of the cage he had built around it years ago. The infants beside her were so small that time itself seemed to pause to let them exist untouched by the sins surrounding them. One shifted slightly, a tiny hand clenching and unclenching against the blanket embroidered with his family crest. Lightning revealed what his soul already knew before reason could deny it. The soft black curls of their hair mirrored his own. And their eyes, though closed, carried the shade of green that belonged to only one woman, his mother. The sound of thunder faded into a distant hum as Dominic took a single step closer, the edge of his fury crumbling into dust, leaving behind a hollow ache that no empire could fill. The room, once the throne of his solitude, had become a sanctuary without his permission. The rain outside slowed, as if the heavens themselves feared to disturb the fragile miracle lying before him. The world that had defined him by fear and control was suddenly irrelevant. The battlefield, the blood, the money, all of it meaningless compared to the sight that waited quietly in the center of his empire. In that silent storm of revelation, Dominic Russo, the man the underworld called a king, stood not as a conqueror, but as a man stripped bare by fate, facing the one truth he could never fight, that love, no matter how long buried, always finds its way home. The silence that followed felt almost unreal. Thick and heavy, wrapping around Dominic like a shroud woven from the past, pressing down on his chest until every heartbeat felt like a confession. He stood at the edge of the room, unable to breathe for a moment, his mind struggling to make sense of the image before him, a scene so impossibly tender it defied the logic of the life he had built. The empire that stretched across continents, the men who killed in his name, the scars that mapped his body, all of it seemed to dissolve into the faint rhythm of the rain against the windows. He took another slow step forward, each movement deliberate, as though afraid that even the sound of his boots might shatter the fragile world sleeping on his bed. The fire in the hearth cracked softly, the glow reaching toward the sleeping forms, bathing them in gold, painting halos around the innocent faces of the two tiny beings who had somehow appeared in his world of iron and blood. He noticed how Serena's arm rested protectively over them, her hand curved just slightly. An unconscious gesture that spoke of years he hadn't witnessed. Of nights she must have stayed awake to soothe their cries. Of a strength he had once believed belonged only to him. The thought struck him deeper than any bullet ever had. He could feel the storm outside fading, the thunder moving away into the hills, as though nature itself had decided that what was happening inside this room was far more important than its own chaos. His breath came slowly now, heavy but calm, and his eyes moved to the smallest details, the tiny sock slipping off a baby's foot, the faint flutter of a heartbeat visible in the rise and fall of Serena's chest, the soft shadow of a tear tracked right on her cheek. He didn't know how long he stood there, time had no meaning anymore. It stretched and folded in on itself until everything he had done and everything he had lost became a blur. His gun hung uselessly at his side, his hand numb, the steel now colder than his skin. He thought of all the nights he had spent in this same room, pacing, planning, ordering deaths and vengeance and profit, the weight of power so heavy it had turned him into something less than human. And now, in the same space, something sacred had bloomed without his permission, something pure enough to make that entire history of blood and control seem obscene. The smell of jasmine still lingered faintly in the air. The same fragrance that used to follow Serena when she walked through this house years ago. Before everything had fallen apart, before he had chosen his throne over her heart. That scent now seemed to reclaim the air, to remind him that life had a way of circling back. Of confronting the monsters it created with the innocence they once destroyed. He found himself moving toward the bed, each step drawn by a force he didn't understand, and when he finally stopped at the edge, he looked down at the faces of the children who carried his name without ever knowing it. Their tiny fingers curled and uncurled in sleep, their breaths shallow and perfect, untouched by the ugliness of the world outside those walls. For the first time in years, he felt his heart ache, not from anger or loss or ambition, but from something that demanded surrender. The walls of his fortress, the invisible armor around his soul, began to crumble quietly. And beneath the layers of the Mafia boss, the feared king of Naples, the man who had made entire families vanish with a whisper, there was just Dominic, the son, the lover, the man who had once dreamed of peace before he learned that peace was impossible. The rain began again, softer now, like a benediction against the glass. He could almost hear the heartbeat of the house, steady and alive, answering the rhythm of the three souls before him. His eyes burned, but not from exhaustion. The sting came from something he hadn't felt in so long that he barely recognized it, grace, the idea that the universe had offered him something undeserved. Something beautiful after all the ruin he had caused, made him weak in a way no enemy ever could. He stood there until the storm outside finally gave way to quiet, and the world seemed to exhale. In that stillness, the mansion that had once been his prison began to feel like something else entirely. As though every shadow, every portrait, every scarred memory in its walls had been waiting for this moment to be rewritten. Dominic remained motionless, letting the warmth of the fire and the rhythm of the rain fuse into one sound, a sound that felt almost like forgiveness. And though his mind still refused to understand how fate had brought Serena back, how these two tiny lives had ended up under his roof, his soul already knew that nothing about this night was an accident. Somewhere in the spaces between thunder and silence, between fury and stillness, between loss and love, something within him began to shift, slowly but irreversibly. The storm had not ended when he entered the house, it had merely changed its form, from the violence of rain to the quiet flood of emotion rising inside him. And as the dawn began to creep through the rain-soaked glass, turning the room to shades of golden ash, Dominic Russo understood without words that his empire might still stand outside these walls. But inside this room, he was no longer its king. Dawn bled slowly across the horizon, turning the storm-washed glass to pale amber. And the Russo mansion exhaled after the long night, every polished surface catching the faint tremor of returning light. The rain had quieted to a whisper, its rhythm fading into the distant gardens, leaving behind the scent of wet stone and smoke. A smell that clung to the old wood and the velvet drapes like a ghost reluctant to depart. Dominic had not moved from his place by the bed. He had stood there through the dying hours of the storm, watching the fragile shapes before him as though afraid that the moment would vanish if he dared to blink. When the first trace of sunlight touched Serena's face, something inside him shifted again, subtle but irreversible, the way a crack in marble begins to spread beneath the surface. He had not meant to stay, but the night had anchored him, and now the morning pinned him between past and present, two worlds that no empire could reconcile. The sound of her breathing changed. Her lashes fluttered, and in the pale silence she stirred. For the first time in years he saw her without the haze of memory, no longer the untouchable vision his mind had preserved, but a woman, real, marked by time and by life. The years apart had sculpted her features into something quieter, stronger. There was a stillness in her now that unsettled him more than any gunfire ever had. She blinked, confusion flickering across her face before recognition dawned like a wound reopening. And in that breath between sleep and shock, Dominic felt the ghost of everything he had lost reach out to him again. Her hand tightened instinctively around the blanket, drawing it closer to the two tiny bodies at her side. The reflex of a mother protecting what she loved without thought or hesitation. And that simple motion pierced him deeper than rage could reach. The sunlight climbed higher, spilling warmth across the room, revealing details that the storm had hidden. The faint scuff on the wall from where he had thrown a chair years ago. The untouched books on the shelf, the forgotten piano key that never played right. The mansion looked older, smaller, almost human now under the gentle light, and Dominic realized that the house remembered everything they had been, just as he did. He stood motionless, every muscle taut with the weight of what to say, though no words came. The silence pressed between them, filled with 1,000 unsaid confessions, with memories that still lingered in the corners like dust. The sun caught in the strands of Serena's hair, making them glow faintly against the shadowed sheets. It struck him how something so familiar could still look unreachable. Her eyes, when they met his, no longer carried the fire of the woman who had once challenged his world. They carried endurance instead, the calm that comes after too many storms. For a moment he thought the world had narrowed to those eyes alone, to the pulse of disbelief echoing between them. Then his gaze fell to the small shapes at her side, the delicate rise and fall of two chests, the tiny curls of fingers clutching the blanket, and his breath caught again. But this time the emotion that seized him was quieter, heavier, impossible to name. The golden light touched their faces, and he saw how completely they belonged to neither of them, yet both of them, how fate had conspired in secret to create a truth he had never imagined could exist. The weight of his power, the legend of his cruelty, meant nothing here. The room itself seemed to reject it, shrinking his authority down to the frailty of a man caught between fear and wonder. A current of memory pulled through him, of the night he had walked away, of the arguments that burned like war, of promises broken because ambition had screamed louder than love, and he understood with brutal clarity that time had not erased any of it. It had only hidden it beneath the armor he wore. He became aware of the sounds beyond the room, a servant's cautious footsteps downstairs, the rustle of leaves in the courtyard, the faint chime of the old clock marking a new hour that already felt different from all others. The world continued, indifferent to his revelation, and yet for Dominic every second stretched into eternity. He felt the gravity of everything converge here, in this sunlit silence, where the past he thought buried rose from the ashes and looked him in the eyes through Serena and through the innocent calm of the children. The morning light, gentle and pitiless at once, peeled away every illusion until only truth remained, raw, luminous, undeniable. The empire outside could crumble and rebuild 1,000 times, but this moment would stay carved into him forever. As the fire behind him faded into embers, the warmth touched his back while the cool of morning brushed his face, a meeting of two worlds that had never coexisted until now. And in that fragile intersection of night and day, Dominic Russo, king of shadows, son of ruin, stood before the quiet resurrection of his humanity. Unable to move, unable to breathe, feeling the weight of ghosts not as enemies, but as witnesses, the morning unfolded with the unhurried grace of something sacred. Every minute stretched thin by the tension that filled the room. The light deepened from pale gold to a warmer hue, tracing the edges of Serena's face while Dominic stood rooted to the same spot, his breath almost inaudible, as though sound itself might profane the moment. The storm's residue lingered in the corners, droplets clinging to the window like fragments of last night's violence refusing to let go. Yet inside there was only stillness, the kind that carried the echo of revelation. The weight of sleepless hours pressed behind Dominic's eyes, but fatigue could not dull the clarity coursing through him. He saw everything, every faint line etched by time on Serena's skin, every tremor in her fingers as she adjusted the blanket around the infants, every whisper of air that stirred between them like a memory searching for form. The room's familiar luxury, velvet drapes, dark mahogany, the faint glimmer of silver along the dresser, felt suddenly foreign, as though it belonged to another man, one who no longer existed. He tried to remember the version of himself who had filled these halls with commands and threats. The man who had believed control was the only language worth speaking. But that figure seemed like a stranger carved from marble, cold, magnificent, empty. What replaced him now was painfully alive, raw with a sensation he could not name but felt in his chest like the slow thaw of ice after a long winter. He noticed how the light moved across the twins' faces, soft as breath, and something primal inside him responded to it, a recognition deeper than thought, an instinct that said they were his. The truth settled with the inevitability of gravity, heavy yet strangely pure, and the empire he had built felt irrelevant compared to the fragile rhythm of their breathing. He realized how absurd it was that a man who had ruled armies could feel terror in the presence of two sleeping infants. Yet the fear that gripped him now was not of death or betrayal, but of the responsibility that came with belonging, the quiet demand that life had placed before him without permission. Outside, the estate began to stir, distant voices, the low hum of engines, the subtle return of the world he had left on pause, but he stood apart from it all, caught between confession and awakening. Serena moved slightly, turning toward the window, her profile outlined against the sunlight. He watched her with the intensity of someone witnessing a vision rather than a person. Each breath she took carving deeper into the armor of his indifference. He thought of how many times he had tried to forget her, drowning memory in wine and power, telling himself that love was weakness, that loss could be conquered through violence. Yet here she was, proof that the heart keeps its own ledger, one no empire can erase. The faint creak of the floor beneath his weight reminded him that this was not a dream, that the distance between them was made of air and history, and both were fragile enough to break. He imagined the house below, the corridors where portraits of dead men watched over generations of loyalty and sin. And he wondered what they would think of him now, Dominic Russo, heir to a dynasty of iron. Brought to silence by the simple miracle of life. A shaft of light crossed the carpet and touched the gun still hanging loosely at his side, glinting off the polished steel. The sight jarred him, a sharp reminder of who he was supposed to be, yet the weapon felt irrelevant, almost obscene in this sanctuary of breath and warmth. Slowly he set it down on the nightstand, the faint click of metal against wood sounding like the closing of a chapter he hadn't realized was ending. The gesture did not redeem him, but it freed something inside him, a surrender more profound than any victory he had ever claimed. The mansion seemed to exhale again, its ancient timbers relaxing, the ghosts in the walls receding as if satisfied that the living had finally learned silence. He looked once more at the children, the curve of their cheeks, the faint flutter of lashes, the promise of futures untouched by the weight of his name, and felt a tenderness that frightened him. Not because it was weak but because it was ungovernable. For a man who had mastered everything, this loss of control felt almost divine. The light thickened. Dust motes drifted lazily through it, spinning in quiet orbits like tiny worlds, and Dominic realized that the day had fully arrived. In another hour the mansion would awaken completely, servants would knock, decisions would wait to be made, but this single sliver of morning would remain untouchable, sealed in the hush that followed revelation. He inhaled deeply, the air rich with the mingled scents of rain, wood smoke, and jasmine, and as he let it fill his lungs, the ache inside him transformed into something almost peaceful. An unfamiliar calm that neither victory nor vengeance had ever given him. The ghosts of the past did not vanish. They simply stood aside, allowing him to see what they had been guarding all along, the possibility of redemption not in power, but in presence. And when the first bell of the chapel down in the valley began to ring, its sound faint through the open window, it felt less like a call to duty and more like absolution. The quiet acknowledgement that for the first time in years, Dominic Russo was awake not as a conqueror or a sinner, but as a man remembering how to be human. The night descended with a silence that seemed almost deliberate, wrapping the Russo estate in a kind of reverence that belonged more to memory than to rest. The house, vast and ancient, exhaled softly through its corridors. The faint groan of wood and whisper of wind through the eaves like voices from another century murmuring lullabies to those who no longer believed in peace. Dominic sat alone in the nursery, his shadow long and fractured against the pale blue walls, his body carved from exhaustion but his mind unwilling to surrender to sleep. Two small cribs stood near the window, bathed in the tender light of a half-forgotten moon. And within them the children breathed in perfect rhythm, their chests rising and falling like the tide against some distant shore. Aiden's tiny fist curled near his cheek, Mila's lips parted slightly as though she were whispering to dreams too fragile for this world. Dominic watched them as one might study scripture, each sigh a verse, each motion a revelation. And the more he looked, the smaller he felt beneath the weight of what he had created, both beautiful and broken. He could still feel the scent of gunpowder buried in his skin, the echo of commands shouted into the night, the ghosts of men whose faces blurred into smoke. Power had once been his language, every order, every conquest a syllable in the story he told himself about survival, but here, in the glow of that soft lamplight, he discovered a different vocabulary written in the stillness of two sleeping souls. He had known fear before, the kind that made a man sharpen his instincts to survive, but this was something purer, more fragile, the fear of losing something he had never known he was missing. His eyes traced the soft outlines of the nursery. The delicate curtains Serena must have chosen. The faint scent of lavender clinging to the air. And he realized that this room had been built with love in the same way he had built empires, with purpose, with intent, with the belief that what was created could outlast pain. The irony struck him cruelly. Everything he had fought to possess, every drop of blood spilled in his name, had never granted him the peace he now found in silence. He felt the ache of years pressing against his ribs, the ghosts of choices made in the name of legacy whispering their regret. Somewhere beyond the walls, the world of violence still waited for him, the men, the power, the debts, but here, time bent inward. And the ticking clock on the wall seemed to beat in rhythm with his children's hearts. He wanted to hold them, to feel their warmth seep into his calloused hands, but he was afraid that his touch, so used to destruction, might somehow unmake what was pure. Instead, he sat unmoving, a sentinel in penance, watching, breathing, remembering. His reflection in the window looked older than he remembered, eyes lined with consequence, jaw set in quiet remorse, the kind of face that no longer inspired fear but invited reckoning. The world beyond the glass was asleep, silver fields stretching into darkness, the sky bruised with cloud. He could almost hear the echo of his mother's voice from another lifetime, soft, tired, teaching him that some storms are not meant to be conquered, only endured. Now he understood. This was not a battle of blood or power, but one of forgiveness, an unfamiliar war fought in silence and tenderness. The sound of soft footsteps reached him before he saw her. Serena stood in the doorway, the light brushing her face, her presence both familiar and distant, as though she existed halfway between dream and confession. He didn't move. Neither did she. There was too much between them to bridge with words, too much history coiled beneath the surface like smoke beneath glass. Yet in that quiet moment, something shifted, the invisible gravity between two people who had once known everything about each other and had since learned to live as ghosts. The air trembled with things unsaid, with the weight of forgiveness waiting for courage. Dominic's hand reached toward the edge of the crib, fingers barely grazing the smooth wood. The motion felt sacramental, a vow without sound. The walls around him seemed to fade, the mansion dissolving into the hush of the moment. Until there was nothing left but the rhythm of tiny breaths and the slow surrender of two people remembering what it meant to care. The past hung heavy, but for once it did not suffocate. It merely stood witness as the storm outside softened into rain, the kind that washes rather than destroys. Dominic closed his eyes, letting the sound of it sink into him, and for the first time in years, his heart loosened its grip on anger. He did not yet know what forgiveness would look like, nor whether he deserved it. But he felt it begin to take shape, not in the grand gestures he once believed in, but in the quiet miracle of being present, of staying, of simply breathing beside what he could not yet name as hope. The rain continued long into the night, falling with a rhythm so measured it felt like a heartbeat echoing through the walls of the old estate, carrying with it the scent of earth and surrender. Dominic remained in the nursery long after the lamps had burned low, his body still and heavy, his mind adrift in the quiet storm of recollection. Memories slipped through him like shadows, years of smoke-filled rooms, whispered deals, betrayals signed with blood, and each one dissolved into the steady hush of rainfall against glass. He had been forged in chaos, taught that love was a liability and mercy a weapon that always turned on its wielder. Yet here, surrounded by the faint sound of his children's breathing, the world he once ruled seemed impossibly small. The empire he had built on fear and precision now felt like an echo from a forgotten dream, something that had consumed his youth but never truly belonged to him. He wondered what had driven him all those years, what hollow hunger had made him chase power as though it could replace the warmth he had lost. The rain blurred the horizon outside, turning the gardens into pools of silver. And in the glass he saw his reflection merge with the sleeping figures behind him, a man divided between what he had been and what he might still become. There was a strange serenity in that fracture, as though the universe had paused to let him breathe inside the wound. Serena had retreated down the hall hours ago, leaving behind the faint scent of jasmine and salt, a trail of softness that clung to the air like forgiveness half-spoken. He felt her absence not as distance but as gravity, the kind that draws two celestial bodies toward collision no matter how far they drift. Somewhere deep inside, beneath the armor and scars, something in him began to thaw. He thought of the years she had spent alone, carrying not only the weight of their children but the silence of his choices, the endless nights when his name was whispered in fear rather than love. Guilt rose like smoke, thick and choking, but he did not push it away. He let it fill him, cleanse him, burned through the layers of arrogance that had shielded his heart for too long. The sound of a clock somewhere down the corridor marked the slow passing of time, each tick another reminder that even the mighty are not exempt from the small cruelties of regret. He looked again at Aiden and Mila, their features so innocent it hurt to imagine the world they might inherit if he failed to change. Their existence was proof that life could bloom even in the ruins of men like him, and that realization frightened him more than any enemy ever had. He rose quietly, every movement deliberate, as if afraid to disturb the fragile peace that hung over the room, and crossed to the window. The gardens shimmered under the soft rain, every leaf jeweled, every shadow gentle. He opened the window slightly. Cool air rolled in, damp and clean, washing over his skin like absolution. For a moment he simply stood there, breathing it in, feeling the tension seep from his shoulders until all that remained was exhaustion and the faint stirrings of gratitude. Behind him, the twins shifted in their sleep, and the small sound drew his gaze back. He realized then that his entire world now fit inside this narrow room, no mansions, no syndicates, no thrones of glass and fear, just the fragile, sacred pulse of family. The simplicity of that truth unsettled him, but it also steadied him in a way nothing else ever had. His hands, once instruments of command, now trembled with the need to protect rather than destroy. He reached out, brushing a stray curl from Mila's forehead, then rested a calloused finger near Aiden's tiny hand. The child's fingers twitched, curling instinctively around his, a gesture so small yet so absolute it pierced him to the core. He felt his throat tighten, eyes burning, and before he could stop it a tear escaped, uninvited, unrestrained, the kind that carried not just sorrow but surrender. It traced a slow path down his cheek, a silent confession to the ghosts who had watched him fight the wrong wars. Outside, lightning flickered across the hills, illuminating the horizon in fractured gold. And for an instant he saw the world as it might have been, the same rain, the same earth, but without the blood that had stained his hands. He closed his eyes, letting the image linger until it blurred into darkness again. The storm began to fade, the sound of it softening to a whisper, and the first faint color of dawn seeped into the sky. He turned once more to his children, their tiny forms bathed in the dim light of morning, and something inside him shifted irrevocably. The man who had entered this night carrying centuries of sin would not emerge the same. The world outside might still call him a monster, a legend, a name spoken in fear, but here, in this room of moonlight and lullabies, he was simply a father learning the weight of tenderness. The rain ceased altogether, leaving behind a stillness so profound it felt sacred. And Dominic Russo remained there, motionless and humbled. As the first rays of dawn touched the horizon and the past he once served began, at last, to let him go, the days unfolded quietly, as though time itself had grown cautious of disturbing the fragile peace that had settled over the Russo estate. The mansion, once an empire's heart of power and fear, began to breathe differently. The air carried less command, more warmth, and the echo of laughter replaced the distant hum of violence that had long defined its walls. Morning light streamed through tall arched windows, painting the marble floors with soft gold, and in that radiance, Dominic found a rhythm he had never known before, slow, deliberate, human. He would rise before the household stirred, the weight of the world still heavy on his shoulders. Yet the first sound he heard each day was not the cold click of weapons or the whisper of deals being made, but the small, tender cry of his children waking. It disarmed him more effectively than any rival ever had. He learned the strange choreography of fatherhood with the same intensity he had once reserved for war, the careful tilt of a bottle, the uncertain way his hands supported a fragile head, the quiet wonder that overtook him each time tiny eyes met his. The world beyond the estate continued its restless dance of greed and vengeance, but Dominic no longer felt its pull. He had discovered something rarer than loyalty, peace earned through presence. The men who served him began to notice the change before he spoke of it. They saw it in his eyes, no longer a void of command but a storm subdued, and they whispered among themselves in corridors scented with baby powder and warm milk. The aura of danger still clung to him, but it had softened at the edges, tempered by a gentleness none of them had thought possible. He moved through his days with a kind of quiet determination, the same precision that once orchestrated assassinations now guiding the dismantling of everything he had built in darkness. Documents that once sealed fates were burned in the fireplace. Calls that once controlled cities went unanswered. The machinery of sin ground to a halt, replaced by acts of creation rather than destruction. He liquidated accounts, redirected funds, called in debts not to collect them but to forgive them, and with every decision, the shadow of his past receded a little further into the distance. The city, long held hostage by his name, began to breathe again, unaware that the monster they had feared was becoming a ghost of redemption. Yet none of it felt like sacrifice. Each choice to relinquish power, each deal undone, was accompanied by the faint sound of his children's laughter echoing down the halls, proof that love could fill the spaces violence once occupied. The mansion itself seemed to respond, the once dim corridors glowed brighter, the gardens flourished, the fountains that had fallen silent now sang again with the rhythm of flowing water. Even the portraits of his ancestors, men immortalized in oil and shadow, appeared less severe beneath the changing light, as though the generations of blood behind him were finally exhaling after centuries of vengeance. In quiet hours, Dominic would stand at the nursery door, watching Serena as she rocked one of the twins to sleep, her silhouette framed by the soft halo of lamplight, and he would feel the unfamiliar ache of gratitude. There were moments when he caught glimpses of his former self in the mirror, a flicker of steel in his gaze, the instinctive clench of his jaw, but those ghosts passed quickly, drowned by the simple beauty of ordinary life. He began to rediscover the world in small details, the scent of rain-soaked earth after dawn, the way Serena's hair caught the sunlight, the sound of Aiden's laughter tumbling through the open windows like music. For the first time in years, he understood the meaning of stillness not as idleness but as peace earned through surrender. He no longer needed to prove himself invincible. Survival had given way to purpose. Outside the estate, the men who once bled for his orders now sought his guidance not for conquest but for change, unsure whether to fear or follow the man he was becoming. Some called it weakness. Others called it rebirth. Dominic did not correct them. He knew that redemption was not loud, it was a whisper that grew only in silence. In the evenings, he often stood on the balcony overlooking the city, its skyline flickering in the distance like a constellation of unfinished stories. The wind carried the faint hum of life below, the sound of cars, laughter, distant music, and he realized that for the first time, he could look at that world without wanting to control it. Serena would sometimes join him there, her presence soft but grounding, and together they would watch the horizon until it blurred into the indigo of night. Beneath that vast, forgiving sky, Dominic felt the weight of centuries lift from his chest. The man who had once ruled through fear now ruled only himself, and in that restraint lay the truest power he had ever known. The night air brushed against him, cool and clean, and for the first time in memory, the silence that followed did not feel empty, it felt earned. The night had fallen deep over the hills, wrapping the estate in velvet stillness. And inside its walls the soft sounds of new life threaded through the silence like music composed for healing. Dominic stood by the open balcony doors, the scent of rain-soaked marble and jasmine drifting in from the gardens below, his thoughts moving with the slow patience of a man learning how to breathe again. The city lights shimmered in the distance like restless constellations, but here, within this sacred quiet, he could almost forget that the world once trembled at his name. Behind him, the nursery lamp cast a faint amber glow, outlining Serena's form as she rocked one of the twins, her movements unhurried, her gaze heavy with the kind of serenity born from forgiveness. He watched her from the doorway, the weight of his gaze not in possession but reverence, and for a fleeting moment he imagined what their life might have been had the years of blood never intervened. The thought ached, but it did not wound. Pain had become a familiar language between them, one now spoken softly, without blame. Each day since the storm of their reunion had passed like a rebirth, the routines of ordinary existence forming a rhythm more powerful than any empire he had built. Morning sunlight spilled across high ceilings, chasing away shadows that had lingered too long, and laughter began to replace orders in the halls. The guards at the gate no longer flinched when he passed. They greeted him with uncertain smiles, unsure of how to address a man who had traded his throne of fear for a cradle of love. His men whispered still, unable to reconcile the legend with the father who now carried bottles instead of guns, who knelt on marble floors to collect fallen toys rather than spilled blood. To some, his transformation seemed impossible, a myth spun from guilt. To Dominic, it was penance made tangible, the living proof that even monsters could unlearn their hunger. He had begun visiting the city in secret, not as the Don who once commanded its underworld but as a silent benefactor. Hospitals received anonymous donations. Orphanages were rebuilt. The wounded found shelter where there had once been despair. The streets that had once echoed his name in fear now bore the quiet marks of his redemption, acts unseen but deeply felt. The empire he had constructed with cruelty was dissolving not through violence, but through grace. Yet the transformation did not come without ghosts. Some nights, he would wake drenched in sweat, hearing echoes of old promises, the faces of men he had condemned flickering in the corners of his mind. But when those memories came, he would rise and walk to the nursery, where the sight of his children sleeping dissolved the darkness. Their innocence was his absolution, their breathing his prayer. He would sit beside them until the ghosts retreated, until the night exhaled its sorrow and made space for peace again. Serena noticed the change in him before he spoke of it, how his eyes had softened, how the lines of cruelty once etched in his expression had faded into something more human. She moved through the mansion as if she had always belonged there, her laughter lingering in the air like a hymn that sanctified every corner of the house. The servants adored her, the men respected her, and Dominic, for the first time, found himself anchored by something stronger than ambition. The walls that had witnessed unspeakable acts now absorbed the sound of music and children's laughter. The same marble steps that had carried the weight of soldiers now carried a family. There was poetry in that reversal, and Dominic savored it like a confession whispered to God in secret. One evening, as twilight bled into indigo and the first stars pierced the veil of dusk, he joined Serena on the balcony. The wind moved through her hair, carrying the faint perfume of night-blooming flowers, and though no words passed between them, the silence said everything. The city sprawled beneath them, its chaos distant, its pulse no longer his to command, and Dominic felt, for the first time, small in a way that comforted him. He no longer needed to conquer. He only needed to remain. The laughter of the twins drifted from inside, soft and pure, and the sound seemed to complete a circle he hadn't known was open. The empire of blood had ended, replaced by something infinitely greater, the empire of love that required no allegiance, no violence, only devotion. The stars reflected faintly in Serena's eyes when she turned toward him. And for a moment the world around them disappeared, the crimes, the regrets, the scars, all reduced to a quiet heartbeat shared between two souls who had once been broken by the same fire. When they finally turned to go inside, the air behind them shimmered with the faint echo of something eternal, as though the house itself had blessed their surrender. That night, Dominic Russo, once a man of shadows, laid his head beside the woman who had waited through the ruin of years. Their children sleeping safely between them, and as his eyes closed, he realized that peace was not a reward to be earned, it was a choice to remain where love demanded he stay. The mansion, for the first time in its long and haunted history, knew silence not of dread but of rest, and within its walls, the heart of a redeemed man finally learned how to sleep, under the crimson hues of a dying sun. The once silent mansion now pulsed with tension, its walls echoing with the faint cries of distant chaos. Dominic had begun to sense the shift long before the attack, the subtle tremor in the air, the glances exchanged between his men, the growing unease that something unseen was closing in. The peace he had built with trembling hands now hung by a thread, thin and fragile, like the calm before a storm. The empire he had renounced was still alive in the shadows, whispering his name like a curse. Raphael Vieri, a ghost from the blood-soaked corridors of his past, had returned, not for power, but for vengeance. Dominic could feel the weight of his sins tightening around him, suffocating, as though the universe itself demanded payment for his redemption. He had seen this coming, yet he had dared to hope, a fatal mistake in a world where mercy was weakness. Serena, unaware of the storm about to break, had taken Aidan and Mila to the small chapel by the vineyards, the one place that still held the illusion of sanctuary. The morning was quiet, birdsong floating over the olive fields, sunlight spilling through the chapel's cracked windows. She whispered prayers she had long forgotten, her voice trembling with gratitude and fear, never realizing that men in black cars had already begun their descent down the gravel path. Then came the sound, faint at first, like thunder rolling over the hills, before it erupted into chaos. The screech of tires. The metallic click of guns being drawn. Serena froze, heart hammering, instinct screaming. She clutched her children close, backing toward the altar as the heavy doors burst open. Shadows spilled into the sacred space, Raphael's men, faceless, merciless, their silence more terrifying than their weapons. Time fractured. A scream tore through the air, echoing through the stone walls, shattering the stillness. Serena ran, barefoot on cold marble, her arms wrapped around the twins. The smell of gunpowder filled the air, thick and suffocating. Just as she stumbled toward the side door, headlights cut through the dust outside, Dominic's car skidding to a stop, gravel exploding under its wheels. He stepped out before the engine died, his expression a mask of controlled fury, eyes burning with a promise only death could understand. The air around him changed, the quiet, grieving man who had rebuilt his soul through love was gone. Replaced by the ghost of who he once was, the lion of the Russo name, the night became an inferno of vengeance. Bullets carved through the chapel's silence, glass shattered like rain, and Dominic moved with the precision of a man who had danced with death all his life. He was a storm reborn, his rage cold and beautiful, his every motion driven by love, not hate. He fought not as a boss defending his empire, but as a father protecting his heart. The world narrowed to the sound of his pulse, the cries of his children, the sight of Serena's terrified eyes as she shielded them behind the altar. He moved through the shadows like a specter, brutal, silent, unstoppable. One by one, Raphael's men fell, their echoes swallowed by the roar of vengeance. Then came Raphael himself, stepping from the smoke, dressed in black, his grin twisted with malice and disbelief. "So this is the great Dominic Russo," he sneered, his voice venomous even through the chaos. But Dominic didn't answer, words no longer belonged in this moment. Only the language of blood and resolve remained. The gunfight that followed was short, savage, and final. Two worlds, one of cruelty, one of redemption, colliding in a storm of fire and dust. When it was over, Raphael's body lay among the ruins of the pews, his ambition ending where Dominic's redemption began. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and iron, sunlight cutting through broken glass like the hand of mercy. Dominic staggered forward, chest heaving, a crimson bloom spreading across his shirt. He turned toward Serena, she was on her knees, clutching the twins, her tears glimmering in the golden light. He tried to smile, but his lips trembled, his body failing him. Each step felt heavier than the last, the weight of years pressing down. Serena's scream cut through the silence as she ran to him, catching him before he fell. The twins cried, tiny voices echoing through the hollowed chapel as Dominic's strength began to fade. Blood stained her dress, his breath shallow and uneven. Yet in his dimming eyes there was peace, a kind of serenity that no throne or kingdom could offer. His hand brushed her face, trembling, his fingers tracing the tears on her cheek. He didn't need words. His gaze said everything. He had finally done what he had always promised, protected what mattered. As the sirens wailed in the distance and the world seemed to blur into light and shadow, Dominic closed his eyes. The man who had once ruled empires had found his redemption not in power, but in love, a love that had defied death itself. The wind howled through the shattered windows of the chapel, carrying with it the scent of gunpowder, blood, and the distant wail of sirens. The golden light of evening spilled across the stone floor, painting everything in a hue that felt both sacred and sorrowful. Serena knelt beside Dominic, her trembling hands pressing against the wound that bloomed crimson beneath his ribs. His breathing came in shallow gasps, each one a struggle between life and the darkness calling him home. Around them, the world seemed to fade, the walls, the broken pews, the chaos, until only their small family remained in focus. Aiden and Mila whimpered softly in Serena's arms, their cries piercing through the silence like a prayer. Dominic's gaze drifted to them, the corners of his lips twitching into the faintest of smiles. He had seen death before, he had been its instrument, its companion, but never had it felt so human, so heavy with meaning. This was not the death of a king or a criminal. This was the surrender of a man who had finally found peace. He tried to reach for them, his hand shaking, fingers barely brushing against the tiny curls on his daughter's head. Serena caught his hand and pressed it to her heart, her tears falling onto his knuckles, warm and desperate. The sirens grew louder now, flashing lights dancing against the chapel's broken glass like fleeting ghosts. The sound of footsteps echoed outside, his men, arriving too late. They stormed through the doors, weapons raised, only to stop when they saw their boss cradled in the arms of the woman he had once lost. For a moment, even the most hardened among them felt something shift inside. The invincible Dominic Russo, the man who had commanded fear with a glance, now lay still. His empire reduced to the fragile heartbeat of a family he would die to protect. Serena screamed for help. Her voice raw with anguish, they rushed forward, wrapping him in their coats, shouting orders. But Dominic's eyes had already begun to lose focus. He looked up at the stained glass above, where fractured beams of light formed an image of an angel, its wings broken. Yet still reaching for heaven, his mind drifted to memories buried deep within his scars. The first time he had held Serena's hand under the moonlight of Milan. The first promise he had made to her before he became a monster. And the last words she had spoken before she walked away, "Don't let the world take what's left of you." Those words now echoed in him, fading like smoke. He had tried, and perhaps in the end, he had succeeded. The twins' cries softened as Serena rocked them gently, whispering broken lullabies through her tears. "You're safe now," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was speaking to them or to him. Dominic's eyes fluttered. He wanted to speak but no sound came. Still, she could read his lips, could feel the shape of the words, "I love you." The world outside continued to move, sirens, shouts, engines, but inside the chapel, time froze. His men lowered their guns, heads bowed in silence. The man they had once feared had become something else entirely in his final moments, a legend reborn not through violence, but through love. The ambulance arrived, lights painting the night red and blue, medics rushing inside, but Serena knew before they even touched him that it was too late. His hand grew cold in hers, his eyes distant, yet there was peace etched into his expression, a quietness that felt eternal. She kissed his forehead, her tears falling onto his skin like rain upon marble. Outside, the vines swayed in the wind, their leaves rustling like whispers of farewell. The medics tried to pull her away, but she clung to him, unwilling to let go. Her dress soaked in his blood, her heart breaking into 1,000 unspoken pieces. The chapel, once a place of silence, now stood as a monument to love and loss. Aiden and Mila, wrapped in blankets, were carried to safety by the guards, their tiny faces reflecting the glow of the setting sun. Serena followed, her eyes hollow, yet beneath the grief burned something fierce, not revenge, but resolve. Dominic's death would not be in vain. The empire he had once built through fear would now live on through compassion, through her hands, through their children. She turned back one last time, staring at the chapel doors, and in the fading light, she could almost see him there, Dominic, standing tall and proud, watching over them. The ghost of the man who had once ruled the underworld now lingered as a guardian of peace. The sirens faded into the distance. The world moved on. But somewhere, in the quiet of the Italian hills, where the wind carried whispers through the vineyards and the sky bled gold at dusk, Dominic Russo's legacy lived, not in blood, not in empire, But in the eternal bond of a love that refused to die, the seasons had changed over the Russo estate, trading the scent of gunpowder and smoke for the fragrance of lavender and rain-soaked earth. The once feared mansion that had echoed with footsteps of killers and kings now hummed softly with the laughter of children and the gentle rhythm of peace. Dominic Russo, a name once whispered in fear across Europe's underworld, now walked the same marble halls with bare feet, carrying his daughter on one shoulder while his son clutched his hand. The empire that had taken him years to build and a lifetime to escape was gone, not lost to war or betrayal, but to choice. In one night of clarity, he had burned every ledger, every shipment route, every symbol of his reign until the flames devoured the past and left only ash. The world outside called him a fool, a ghost, a man who traded power for obscurity. But as he watched Aiden and Mila run through the courtyard, chasing butterflies under the golden light of afternoon, Dominic understood that he had not fallen, he had risen. The house that once guarded secrets now held laughter that echoed across its walls, filling the spaces once haunted by silence. He had changed the mansion's heart as he had changed his own. The Grand War Room, once lined with maps of territories and ledgers of blood money, now bore shelves of children's books and framed drawings of crayon hearts. The underground vault that had held golden weapons now stored medical supplies for the Foundation, the Aiden and Mila Trust. His promise to the world that the next generation of lost children would not grow up in darkness as he did. Serena had helped design it, her quiet strength guiding every step. Where Dominic was fire, she was calm water, soothing, unrelenting, shaping him even when he didn't realize it. He often watched her from the garden's edge, sunlight catching in her hair, her laughter mingling with the children's, and he would think to himself that no throne, no crown, no empire could ever rival this. He still bore his scars, both seen and unseen, but they had softened, no longer chains but reminders. In the quiet moments, when the wind whispered through the olive trees, he could almost hear his old self, the cold, ruthless shadow he once was, watching from afar. Unable to enter this new world he had built, that afternoon. As the twins played in the garden, Serena appeared at the balcony, her dress brushing the flowers as she descended the steps. The sun bathed her in gold, and for a moment, Dominic thought she looked like a vision, the living proof that redemption was not earned, but given. She smiled when she saw him, a smile that still undid him completely. He met her halfway, pulling her close, his arms wrapping around her like the only vow he'd ever need to keep. The years of pain, betrayal, and loss faded into the background, replaced by the steady heartbeat of home. Serena leaned into him, her head resting against his chest, listening to the rhythm that had once belonged to a killer but now beat for love alone. Around them, the world felt whole, the garden alive with colors, the air soft with the scent of roses, the laughter of Aiden and Mila drifting like music. For the first time in years, Dominic felt what true power was, not the kind that conquered cities or commanded loyalty through fear, but the kind that healed, nurtured, and built something eternal. He whispered against her hair, his voice low, trembling with truth, "I lost the world chasing power. But I found heaven holding you." Serena looked up at him, eyes shimmering with tears that didn't speak of sorrow but of gratitude. "Our family was your redemption," she whispered, and those words, more than any confession or prayer, set him free completely. He kissed her forehead, and in that simple act lay every promise he'd ever broken and every one he would now keep. Behind them, the children's laughter rose again, pure and bright, carrying through the air like bells of hope. Dominic watched them, his legacy, his salvation, and knew that the name Russo no longer belonged to the underworld. It belonged to life, to love, to rebirth. As the sun dipped low behind the vineyards, painting the sky in hues of rose and gold, he took Serena's hand and walked with her toward the garden. The wind stirred gently, carrying whispers of the man he used to be, but now, those whispers no longer haunted him. They simply bowed, fading into silence, as if even the ghosts knew that Dominic Russo, the man once ruled by violence, had finally been claimed by grace. In that stillness, surrounded by love and laughter, he understood the final truth of his story. that redemption is not found in forgetting who you were, but in choosing, every day, to become someone better. And so, the Mafia boss who once ruled through fear was, at last, ruled by love, and in that surrender, he found eternity. Evening descended softly over the Tuscan hills, washing the Russo estate in hues of amber and violet, the kind of twilight that whispered peace into places where war once lived. The mansion glowed like a sanctuary, its tall windows flickering with candlelight instead of the cold gleam of security alarms. Its silence broken only by laughter and music instead of orders barked through clenched jaws. Dominic sat in the courtyard beneath a canopy of wisteria, the twilight shadows curling around him like old ghosts finally at rest. The twins, Aiden and Mila, tumbled through the grass nearby, their small hands clutching at bubbles that shimmered in the fading light, their laughter rising like a hymn to a world reborn. Serena stood by the fountain, her reflection rippling in the water, her eyes catching the last gold of the sun. He watched her quietly, the woman who had once been a ghost of his regrets now the living pulse of his salvation. Every scar on his body told a story of what he had lost, but in her presence, he saw what he had gained, a peace he had never known, a purpose beyond power, a love untainted by ambition. The air carried the scent of rosemary and rain, blending with the soft echo of church bells in the distant village below. It was as if the world itself exhaled, forgiving him at last. The empire he had once ruled had become legend, a whisper in backroom bars, a story told by men who never truly knew him. Dominic Russo vanished, they'd say. No one defies the underworld and survives. But they were wrong. He had not vanished, he had simply chosen to live. Every morning he woke before dawn, watching the sun rise from his study window as the vineyards caught fire with light, and he would remind himself that survival was not enough. Redemption had to be earned, not through penance, but through purpose. And so the Aiden and Mila Trust became his life's work, shelters for children orphaned by violence, schools where the lost could find direction, homes where silence no longer meant fear. He visited each one personally, walking through halls filled with laughter, walls painted in color instead of blood. The men who once called him Don Russo now called him Senior Dominic, their loyalty shifting from obedience to admiration. It was strange, to be feared once and loved now, but it felt right. Serena often accompanied him, her presence grounding him when the weight of his past pressed too heavily. There were nights when nightmares still clawed at him, faces of the fallen. Echoes of screams, flashes of fire and betrayal, but when he awoke, drenched in sweat, Serena was always there. Her hand on his chest, her voice a soft anchor pulling him back to the present point. One evening, rain began to fall over the garden, fine and silver. The kind that turned everything it touched into a memory. Dominic stood in it, unbothered by the chill, letting the water wash over his skin as if cleansing what still clung to his soul. Serena joined him, her laughter breaking through the sound of rain, her dress plastered to her skin, her hair wild against the wind. He looked at her and felt the impossible, joy, unfiltered and alive. Aiden and Mila ran between them, shrieking with delight, their tiny feet splashing through puddles. The sight made him laugh, a sound so rare and genuine that Serena turned to look at him in wonder. For the first time, he did not see the shadow of the Mafia boss in his reflection, only a man reborn, free at last. He lifted Serena into his arms and spun her in the rain, their laughter blending with the children's, the storm washing the world clean around them. The ghosts of the past lingered at the edges of the estate, but they no longer had power. Love had conquered what bullets could not. As night fell, Dominic carried the twins to their beds, their tiny hands curled around his fingers until sleep claimed them. Serena waited in the garden, the moonlight soft against her face. When he joined her, she looked up, eyes glistening. "You kept your promise," she whispered. Dominic smiled faintly, his voice low, rough from emotion. "I broke every vow I ever made to the world," he said, "but not the one I made to you." They sat together beneath the olive tree, the stars blooming across the sky like sparks from an unseen fire. In that vast stillness, Dominic felt the universe quiet around him, as though even fate had paused to witness what it had once thought impossible. the rebirth of a man who had defied his destiny. He drew Serena close, his arm wrapping around her shoulders, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. The life before had been built on fear, but this was built on love, faith, and forgiveness. The night air hummed softly, carrying the scent of jasmine and the echo of distant waves. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in his life, the silence within him was not emptiness, it was peace. The Mafia king who had once ruled through fear had found a throne not of gold, but of love, a kingdom bound not by blood, but by the eternal grace of a family reborn.